Hi, everybody. Welcome. Glad to see everybody here. I'm Alex Colvin, Dean of the ILR School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to one of the highlights of our year, our annual Cook-Gray lecture. This is a lecture that was established by the school in honor of two of our great former faculty members, two great women faculty, Alice Cook and Lois Gray, who were with the school from the 40s and 50s onwards, obviously during a period when female faculty were not as well represented as happily they are today. And it was really important for the school to recognize their path-breaking roles. Alice Cook was a labor historian who taught at the school for many years, influenced many students, and in fact, this lecture is supported by an endowment that was raised by former students' donations in honor of her. Lois Gray was a faculty member dating back to the 1940s, actually worked in our extension division right up through her passing about 5 years ago at the age of 94, and was really through the whole history of the school, a great expert on union democracy, labor relations, the arts and entertainment industry, a wonderful figure in the history of our school. This lecture is organized by our colleague Pam Tolbert, who actually holds the Lois Gray Professorship, which honors Lois. So a nice connection there. This is a lecture that was established in honor of their areas of focus of social justice and equality. Today's lecture by Cecilia Ridgeway, who you'll hear a little more about in a sec from Pam, this lecture will really, I think, very much speak to the issues that were of interest to both Alice Cook and Lois Gray. So it's a wonderful kind of celebration this year. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague Pam to do a more detailed introduction of our lecture today. So Pam.
Thank you, and thanks all of you for being here to hear our 21st in this series, 21st distinguished speaker, Professor Cecilia Ridgeway, who comes to us from Stanford University. And as Alex said, the whole series is, built around two very distinguished former faculty in the ILR school, Alice Cook and Lois Gray. I was going to tell you more about them, but I think you get the drift. They were both very beloved, and they were very activist, as well as scholars, and did a lot of work contributing to women in the workplace. So in this context, really happy to have our speaker today, Professor Cecilia Ridgeway, who is the Lucie Stern Professor of Social Science in the Sociology Department at Stanford University. But the key thing to know about her is that she is actually an alum of the Cornell Sociology Department. She got her degree here in the turbulent years of the early 70s. And she has some great anecdotes about her student activism there, which she got to reprise a little bit today, walking around campus. There was another protest. So out on the Arts Quad protest, it was all like old home week. So I'll let her share the anecdotes with you or not, as she wishes. But I think it's fair to say that her early concerns with the problem of social inequality that drove a lot of that activism continue to be reflected in her research today. This is, as she once noted, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, we're not going to understand gender inequality or other inequalities unless we understand the interpersonal processes that mediate and enact institutional structures and larger patterns of inequality. So her work is very much focused on linking micro-level processes with larger societal level outcomes and back and forth. In particular, her work focuses on how societally defined status characteristics like race and gender affect interactional patterns in ways that often end up, they shape those patterns and then they often end up reproducing and reinforcing social inequality. This research program has generated a voluminous output. I actually started trying to count the number of publications, but I quit at 100. I figured that's enough. And her record of scholarship has been recognized by a variety of awards and honors, including 2 major awards by the American Sociological Association, the top awards, that is the Cooley-Mead Award for Social Psychology and the Jesse Bernard Award for Research on Women. And both were honoring her lifetime contributions, scholarly contributions. She was also, in line with this, elected a few years ago as the president of the American Sociological Association. So please join me in welcoming this eminent scholar back to Cornell.
It really is a pleasure to be here. I mean, I thought it would be, right? Since I haven't been here in a few years. I came several times after I graduated, but then it's been maybe all pushing 20 years since I've been on campus. So I felt I was gonna enjoy it, but it's really been great to go around to talk to people, to see things. And as I said, that little protest I saw not too long ago over the lunch period, shouting various things. And I thought, all right, this is the same old place. And that's always good to see. Whether you agree or not with all the protests, at least the ferment, the thinking, the attitudes, the hope of change, right? The hope of change for societies in the world. And I felt like, you know, it was a reinfusion of those kind of things. So that was absolutely great. It's quite an honor, frankly, in many ways, to be here for this distinguished lectureship, and also, you know, back to the home sod. You know, it's quite an honor to come back. So I'm grateful for that. But rather than take up all your time with all that kind of stuff, let me just dive in here and talk about what I'm going to talk about. And it's this whole business of status. And I'm interested in both defining what it is. Where's it? What is it in the air of the word? What is it? But then particularly to hone into why it's important for race and gender inequality, for carrying it out. And you got some hint of that with what was said. And the talk is going to be based on parts of this book. Okay, so let's get into it, right? Stop fooling around. The social scientists, as you broadly all are probably, are familiar with Max Weber's famous delineation of resources, power, and status as distinct bases for inequality in modern societies. And control over resources, including money, and access to positions of power in organizations that produce and distribute resources are the closely related processes that provide the material representation of inequality in society, right? Social status is profoundly different from that. Status is a form of inequality that's based on differences in esteem and honor and respect. It's ancient and it's apparently universal in human societies, and yet it nevertheless pervades modern institutions and organizations and everyday life. We see status all around us, in the workplace, in the classroom. Who was cool in that classroom, right? In the neighborhood you live in, you live where? And in the groups we socialize in, and the objects that we surround ourselves with. And yet we barely understand status as a social process. What is it? And why? How does it happen? Why does it matter, both to individuals and for inequality in society? And especially, I would say, for inequality based on social differences, like gender or race. Now, status is often treated as a side topic by social scientists who care about inequality, both because it is a little different on itself, and because it is assumed to be less consequential for life outcomes than, say, material realities, and therefore not fundamental, right, to understanding inequality in a complex modern society. Status, and maybe it's big and, you know, back in a little primitive society, not for us, right? It's not important for us. Status, it is presumed, is just a vanity, right? And that, I argue, is a major mistake that underestimates both the power of status as an individual motive and its central role in perpetuating durable patterns of inequality based on social differences, such as gender and race and class as culture. At the micro level, we are never going to understand the fundamental human motivations that enter into the struggle for precedence that lies behind inequality if we don't take into account how much people care about their sense of being valued by relative to others, by the groups and communities to which they belong. That's status. How valued are you by the groups and community that you belong to compared to others? Anderson and his colleagues have concluded, based on an extensive review of social science evidence, that the desire for status is in fact, a fundamental human motive, like belonging or something, which affects not only short-term well-being, but even health. Status is one of the most powerful triggers of health outcomes over the life course. Status motivates a wide range of behavior, and it's apparent across all human cultures. In keeping with this, research shows that feeling disrespected in a social relation is a powerful trigger for anger. If someone cuts you off, partly you're being dissed there, right? But being disrespected in a social relation is a powerful trigger for anger and even aggression. If you doubt the importance of status for people's behavior, consider recent US elections and the rise of iconoclastic politics and candidates. There's plausible evidence to suggest that at least some of the anger that fuels support for the politics like this among white working class and white rural voters in the US stems from the symbolic status insult some people feel with the increasing cultural hegemony of urban elites and the changing racial and gender dynamics. At a more micro level, excuse me, I was just talking about the micro level. At a more macro level, status is important because it plays a powerful role in constructing and reproducing inequality based on membership in social difference groups, such as gender, race, and class as culture. In fact, I'm going to argue that it's status that gives systems of inequality based on social differences like gender or race an independent, that is somewhat autonomous, capacity to reproduce themselves. And that is an ability to reproduce themselves on the basis of race or on the basis of gender, and not just on the basis of the average group differences in control of power or resources among people of given races or genders. This is a topic I'm going to turn to shortly, but for now, my point is, given its fundamental power and importance, we need to understand what status is as a basic form of inequality. So that's what we got to start with here. So I'm going to start then by making a case for why I claim status is at root, and then I'm going to turn to its implications for gender and race inequality. I argue that status hierarchies are best understood as a human cultural invention to organize and manage social relations in situations that are inherent to the nature of human life. And these are situations in which people are cooperatively interdependent to achieve valued goals they cannot achieve alone. How did little flimsy us make it through the Ice Age, right? Cooperative interdependence, doing things together, right? It's what we have over many other primates, that we did more of that than others, right? How did we make it? This is fundamental to human survival. Problem is, these situations also create nested competitive interdependence to maximize individual outcomes from the shared effort. Status is everywhere, partly because these cooperative competitive situations are so fundamental to the human circumstance. People have to cooperate with others to get most of what they want, need in life, from the basics of survival to we got to get a job, to what it takes to make them happy. But this deep cooperative interdependence has that inherent competitive tension nested in it. When people coordinate their efforts, questions necessarily arise about the terms on which their relationship will be conducted. How will the spoils of their joint efforts be divided? Who will be the center of attention? According to whose will and judgments will joint actions be determined? What costs does each of us have to put up with in order for us to do this? Everybody has an unavoidable interest in forming cooperative endeavors, but everybody also has an interest in maximizing what they get out of these endeavors. I argue that status is a root, a sociocultural schema or blueprint for organizing social relations in order to manage this basic tension and produce some collective outcomes. The social theorist, William Sewell, has argued that social structures have a dual nature, consisting on the one hand of a cultural scheme of rules, how to do it, for enacting the structure, and on the other hand, of the material distribution of behaviors and resources that result from that enactment. So I'm arguing that the social cultural schema of status is a structural schema in this sense. It's a set of deeply learned, taken for granted cultural rules that people use to organize their behavior with others in a manner that produces a status hierarchy. That is a behavioral ranking and esteem that is demonstrated through deference, prominence, and influence over collective decisions. As people draw on, I argue, the familiar, if implicit, cultural schema of status to organize the many cooperative shared endeavors that they engage in, status provides social life from the interpersonal to the organizational. My argument so far leads to two more questions. First, of course, if status is a cultural schema of rules, what are the rules, right? Second, what is the evidence for this crazy idea that status is a set of common knowledge, and I'm going to make an argument about the common knowledge business. What is the evidence for that status is a set of common knowledge normative rules that is shared as group culture? Rules, of course, can be recognized not only through their enactment, but through their enforcement. That's where you see rules. Violate the rule, get sanctioned, and you think there's a rule, right? Okay. So from there, after I get past that business about what it is, from there, I'll turn to our question about how the nature of status as a cultural schema lies behind its role in spreading status, not only spreading status everywhere, but reproducing inequality based on social difference groups. Okay, so if status is governed by a scheme of rules, then let's figure out the rules, right? In situations in which people are interdependent to achieve a goal, who ends up high status and influential affects everyone's interest. In other words, depending on whether who ends up there is going to affect whether our team wins, right? As a result, whatever status each person egoistically desires for themselves in the group, people want others in the group to defer to those others who seem most able and willing to contribute to the collective effort, since that will maximize the collective success and the shared benefits that flow back to the members from that shared success. So I say, shut up and listen. That person sounds like they have something good to say. I want you to defer on that basis, on expected value to the group effort. But the problem with that is while I'm pressuring you to defer on that basis, other people in the group will be pressuring back at you, right back at me, to defer on that basis myself. So I create pressure for you and you create pressure for me. And in this way, cooperative goal interdependence creates the basic, if implicit, norm of status. And there's evidence that these situations do create norms. The implicit norm of status by which status and influence is granted to group members in proportion to their perceived value to the collective effort. There is overwhelming evidence that interpersonal status hierarchies do indeed act as if they're following this norm. That is, they do grant status in proportion to perceived value. Perceived value to the collective effort. Now, the norm of status, which is this thing that I'm calling the norm of status, manages the cooperative and competitive tensions of collective goal or efforts in several ways. First, it provides a means by which the group exercises some, not complete, but some control over a would-be dominator who threatens to take over the group without contributing to the shared endeavor. I just want to be in charge, I don't care, right? It provides some means for sanctioning that person. In a study of status among MBA students, Anderson and his colleagues showed that students who tried to claim higher status than their peers felt was justified by their value to the team, and these teams are rated, about this. Those students who tried to claim higher status than their peers thought were justified were isolated and disliked by their teammates. In an earlier study of my own, I found that when a group member attempted to seize influence through dominating behavior, that was not backed up by any particular competence of the group task, other members turned on the dominator and rejected him and her, right? They basically mobilized against the dominator. This happened in male and female groups. In other words, people enforce the basic status norm with sanctions against violators, and they do it spontaneously, right? Okay, now, furthermore, by offering esteem, it's not all there is to the effects of this basic norm, right? Furthermore, by offering esteem and influence for contributing to the group effort, the norm of status also incentivizes group members to funnel their energy and aspirations into doing the best they can on the group's behalf. In other words, how do I get the stuff I want? Well, I got to look like I have something to offer, so I have to make an effort here. Funding their efforts that way. Finally, by granting influence in proportion to the perceived value of members' contributions, the status norm provides a system for resolving disagreements, who we're supposed to listen to here, and combining individual contributions into a collective line of action, finally deciding which pizza place you're going to go to, right? And that aids goal attainment, getting dinner, right? So for those reasons, right, status hierarchies have been called by Anderson and Willer a boundedly functional solution to the problem of that dangerous word, functional, boundedly functional solution to the problem of cooperative goal attainment. But this is the sense in which status is a brilliantly useful social technology that people have developed, a sense in which it has some things that help it work, right? But status hierarchies are only boundedly functional because they're based on perceived value of one member's contributions compared to another. And perceptions are subject to error, but also to bias and manipulation. And there's a lot of motives for manipulation, right? Out of that can come, that same competitive tension, right? Out of that can come not only individual conflict amongst members, but perceived injustice among the members based on their social differences. This problem is brought to the fore by the second part of the status schema, a part that is as necessary functionally to the status process as is that basic status, right? And that's status beliefs. The norm of status prescribes deference to others on the basis of this perceived value to the group. But that demand immediately confronts the individual member with a second question. How can she figure out what her fellow members will take to be the signs of greater or lesser value to the group? How can I look good to these people? What does it take, right? How do I figure that out? In Western societies, by the way, value to the group, this varies culturally, cross-culturally, but in Western societies, value to the group is typically understood as perceived goal-related competence along with effort. You're able and willing and working hard, right? I argue that people solve this second coordination problem, figuring out what everybody wants, what looks good, right? By developing shared cultural status beliefs about the differentiating social attributes and behaviors that in their culture indicate higher or lower levels of status worthiness and types of goal-related competence. Experiments that, and these are these status beliefs, right? Experiments I've conducted show that people form status beliefs about social differences among them extremely easily. I can go through little 3 rounds of an experiment and create status beliefs about made up differences, right? Have done so multiple times. So they form these differences quite easily. And also in the replication crisis, others have done this. Other evidence shows that status beliefs are widespread in US culture. They're not just there in the laboratory, right, with those little fake ones that make up half people and induce in people. Research shows that status beliefs are embedded in the widely held stereotypes. There are elements of the widely held stereotypes of all the major groups by which inequality is patterned in American society, including gender, race, education, occupation, so on. North Americans, by the way, also have status beliefs linking assertive agentic behavior with greater status and competence. Those are not universal, but North Americans have those. These same status studies, particularly the stereotype studies of Fisk, right, show that status beliefs are recognized by people as common knowledge. And that they are presumed to be the beliefs of most people. In other words, I presume you know them just as I think most people know them. They're presumed to be widely shared beliefs. In that way, status beliefs serve as a ready basis for coordinating judgments, right, of value to the group, allowing group members to quickly form. This is how people do it. How do they come together and form status hierarchies? They read these cues, they have cultural information of what the cues mean. They presume whether they believe that cultural information themselves, and on a personal basis, doesn't matter. They presume they know the beliefs that are out there in the culture. It's a matter of cultural knowledge, and they presume you know too. So if this is what those rules say, then this is what they're going to be thinking. This is what I'm thinking. We have to take that into account. That's how they coordinate their behavior. So that's how they allow themselves to form these hierarchies. Okay, so what you end up then with is the idea, right, that the cultural schema that governs status hierarchies is actually twofold. There is a taken for granted fundamental status norm that people learn from experience. They learn in school, basically run from dealing with other people, learn from experience and pass on to others from their behavior, almost never articulated. People combine this deeper, more implicit normative rule with a more explicit, sometimes stated, variable, culturally specific, and historically changing set of status beliefs that they use to anticipate what others will see as better, more competent, and valuable in various situations. And status beliefs do change, right? You used to be stupid if you were Irish, right? Now no one cares if you're Irish except St. Patrick's Day. You know, you weren't white, right? That famous argument. But the status beliefs change, right? Status beliefs do change. A lot of things work to maintain them, but they can change, right? Those are more historically contention and what counts as a status characteristic. They don't care about that anymore. They care to these other things. So those things are ongoing. That set of coordinating things changes, but you have the norm, and then you have the changing rules that you use to fill in what counts now. Okay. Now, status beliefs are usually not about us and them between entirely separate groups, but about readily apparent social differences among people within a community or a society who must deal with one another in cooperative endeavors. This is what makes status beliefs useful for forming hierarchies. Gender is, of course, the classic example of the difference within a group. But so are, in a broader society way, race, region, religion, education, right? Status beliefs work to quickly coordinate behavior because there's shortcuts. There's simplified stereotypes. People like this are usually better and more competent at this kind of thing we're doing than people like that. But as stereotypes, right? As stereotypes, they introduce bias and inaccuracy into perceptions of value to the group. And in so doing, of course, they reduce the effectiveness, the functional effectiveness of the status hierarchy as a tool for collective goal attainment. But not only do they reduce task effectiveness, they also introduce inequity into the inequalities in esteem and honor that the status hierarchies create. Biased by status beliefs, these differences in esteem and respect are not fully deserved, either by the high or the low, right? In terms of actual value to the group. As common knowledge cultural beliefs, it's a hallmark of status beliefs that they're generally accepted as a matter of social reality. In other words, you know that this is what other people think, right? That you may not approve of them. By those that they cast low status as well as they can't cast high status. In other words, low status people know they're low status, according to these beliefs, right? Whether they think it's right or not, they know that. But by doing that, right, because they have that, well, that's the way it is, folks, aspect about it. Status belief legitimates some of the biases they introduce into status hierarchy, right? Because everybody knows that's the way it is. It creates a degree of legitimacy, that ongoing sense that this is the way it is, right? But there are, of course, and very, it's hard to live with the idea that it's that way, but I don't believe it, if you keep doing it, but you buy in at some level. But there are limits on that constraint. Those who belong to social difference groups that are devalued by status beliefs, such as women or devalued racial groups, have an interest that those who are advantaged by them don't have an interest in seeing through the beliefs and organizing to change them. And that interest creates a churning potential for conflict and change in society. And here we see how status processes are inherently a double-edged sword that both helps organize cooperative endeavors and sows seeds of competition and conflict within those endeavors. Okay, so that's like the big picture. What is it, kind of thing? But now let's first talk about a little evidence. This crazy idea of yours, Cecilia, why are we talking about this? So what's the evidence for this? And then, which is going to be of the modest type. And then into its implications for the gender and race things. Well, I've already, so the evidence thing, I've already cited a couple of studies where people seem to be sanctioning people, those things that I cited earlier. Let me also describe now some evidence from the 2017 study of mine with Sandra Nakagawa that also provided. The study was conducted for another reason, but it has data that also supports this. What happens in the experiment is that a lower status member of a 3-person work team, so there are 2 higher status members and there's a lowest status member, that lowest status member disagrees with one of the highest status members' task choice. The basic status norm says that in this situation, once they realize they disagree, the lower status member, who's presumed to be less competent, should agree to defer to the presumably more competent higher status members agree. Oh, you're probably right. Go along. Okay, in the study, the 2 higher status participants are asked how they would view the low status member in this situation if the lowest status person either did agree to go along with the high status member's choice for the final group decision. In other words, they deferred as they were expected, or if this lowest status person stuck to their own opinion and resisted. So they say, how would you view this person? In one case, the disagreement is with the other high status member, the 3-person group. But in another situation, it's with self. You're a high status member, right? It's with me. This is different than me, right? Okay. So if the participants are following a norm for status, of course, they should react with greater approval for deference than resistance, right? But crucially, if it's a norm, they should react with similarly greater approval for deference to the other high status member in the group. You didn't properly defer to that high status person. Other similar disapproval for if a person resists the other high status member, and be similarly approving if the person defers to their other high status member, as for deference to the self. And that is just what we found. I'm not going to show you the graphs, but the graphs are very similar. There's it's like a 0.06 difference between them, right? Of it being slightly more intense, your reaction, when it's you, not the other. This suggests that that the participants were indeed following a cultural norm in approving of the low status member for deferring, rather than just repaying the low status member for direct deference. Okay, so what about then evidence for the second part of the schema, the cultural status beliefs? Well, I hate to say it, I'm going to go into it right now, but there's tons of evidence from the status generalization effect, you know, going back to the 50s, Stradbeck and all that, showing that your status within a group, that your status of your outside identities and things that you bring into the group biases for other people's assumptions about your systematically and similarly biases both other actors and your own perceptions of your competence performance in the situation. Okay, so now let's go on and think about this in terms of the implications of this, if this is the case, if there is this cultural schema. Well, one implication of it has to do with why is status everywhere? Why is it in your objects and in the neighborhood, and why is it everywhere, right? Well, as Sewell pointed out, if something is rooted in a cultural schema, right, or blueprint for organizing social relations in a certain way, it can be, that blueprint can be applied permissively to new situations and phenomena beyond its context of origins. It's like getting a new pair of scissors. You start to think, yeah, I could cut this, cut that. All right. You think of new things, right? Because of its cultural nature, right? It's transportable, right? Because of its cultural nature, people can apply status as a way, as a cultural set of rules. People can apply status as a way of coordinating with others in a range to, let's do it this way, and range to a broad range of social phenomena well beyond the interpersonal group. Espelon and Sauter, for instance, have showed how status rankings of law schools develop and become consequential points of reference for the schools and students alike. Shelley Carell and Ezra Zuckerman and I have shown with others that when people have to make a decision whose success depends to some degree on the reactions of others, in other words, it'll only be successful if others buy in. People draw on the status beliefs about the various, what is the status of the various options to make a choice that will coordinate well with the likely reactions of others. And unfortunately, this can mean that even if a decision maker thinks that, say, the woman candidate for police chief is as or slightly better than the male candidate, the decision maker may still favor the male candidate as easier to sell to others. Right. So the very broad, or the person with the Harvard background versus the person with the Penn State background, right? To sell to others. The very broad reach of status rankings in advanced industrial society is hard to explain without understanding its nature as a sociocultural schema. Okay. Now back to gender and race, right? Now I'd like to turn to my point about one of the most, there are surely a lot of consequences to this, but one of the most important, at least to me, of status as a form of inequality is that it gives inequality based on social differences of gender and race or classes, culture, this independent, semi-autonomous capacity to reproduce themselves. And this argument turns on the status belief part of the cultural schema of status, right? In studies that I've done on how people form status beliefs, I mentioned some of those things, in the first place, suggests that the experiences people have in interpersonal hierarchies, right, can transform people's beliefs about mere difference, say the yellows versus the blues, into shared beliefs that people in one group, say the blues, are not only different from the yellows, but they are in fact more competent and esteemed at what we're doing here than the other group, right? And that most people at least would see that, right? And in these studies, and it was the experience of what happened to people in the room, because in these studies, I tried to check at various possible, basically mediation type analysis, what types of possible causes it could be that cause them to come out at the other end of these beliefs. And it's the experience of the hierarchy that makes a difference. Take that away, it doesn't, you don't get the answer. You don't get that experience, right? You don't get the outcome. Okay, in these studies, the indicator that shared status beliefs have formed is that even those who end up in the low status group, it's easy to believe your own group is high status. It's not hard to talk people into that, right? But those who end up in the low status, the group that ends up low status develops, and that means they've gone through these hierarchies where they're treated in this low status way, and they basically make an attribution to their group difference from what their personal experience, right? Who've been treated that way, right? The indicator that they have those beliefs is that they develop beliefs that most people would see the typical member of their group, right? As lower status, less respected, and less competent than the typical member of the other group, even if they don't agree. But they think most people face it, would see that, would think that, right? Now, particularly insidious is the way that these kinds of experiences in interpersonal hierarchies can transform a mere resource or power advantage possessed by people in one group. On average, more people in this group are richer, or on average, more people in this group have power in various important social organizations or institutions on average, so that more likely when people from different groups encounter, people from that group are the ones that have the resource power advantage in the background. But the experience that happened in these encounters, right, can transform a resource or power advantage, right, into a status advantage by fostering cultural beliefs that the people in the advantage group are not only richer and more powerful, but would be viewed by most people as more respected and competent and worthy of esteem. Well, and you might say, well, if you're rich and you're powerful, why does it matter if you're also high status because of your group identity? It matters because status gives you an additional advantage that works even in relation to the members of the lower status group that are just as rich and powerful for you. So you, with your high status, you're just as rich as that other person, right? But that the high status person, even though they have no more money and no more power than you, has an edge on you, can raise an eyebrow at you and so look at you. And the status thing is there, right? It gives them an advantage in terms of influence, in terms of all kinds of things, in terms of a promotion, in terms of advantages and opportunities for exchange, right? So it gives them an additional one. Now, as I've mentioned, when there's status beliefs about a group difference, they systematically bias the perceived, I'm repeating myself here, but the perceived competence of status working of the actors associated with identity. So people will be biased in a business meeting, a job interview, or an encounter between a patient and a doctor, for instance. Actors from the status advantaged group, like say in our society, whites or men, are presumed to be a little bit more competent and appropriate for leadership than are otherwise similar actors from status disadvantaged groups, like people of color or women. As a result, a woman in a similar position with similar pay as a man may still be slightly disadvantaged. It can be a slight disadvantage, slightly disadvantaged compared to him for promotion by the implicit status-based assumption she's not quite as broadly competent and worthy of leadership and capable of leadership. Now, note that the advantage that status beliefs give of the man in this situation is not based on his individual attributes, but on his group identity. And the same is true about race. It's based on group identity. So man, this is the beginning, though, of how status, whatever you think about that personally, this is the beginning of how status beliefs give an inequality based on group and identity and independent capacity to reproduce it, because it's not based on these particular attributes, it's based on the identity, right? So that's what gives it a capacity to reproduce itself. Okay. While this extent of this group-based bias and expectations can be large, in most situations, it's very small. It's a little weight on the scale. It's a little this versus that, right? If there's any real differences in their competence, usually the competence overwhelm it, right? But if they're equally competent and there's a little difference, right? It's a little weight on the scale. It's often small in any given encounter. But the effects of these small biases accumulate over multiple encounters in all of the different organizational and institutional settings that are consequential for inequality: the classroom, the workplace, the boardroom, the hospital, all the little places, police. The effect is to systematically direct actors from status advantaged groups towards positions in power with greater resources and power than those that flow to actors from statuses, right? Through multiple little things that are systematically carving out separate paths. And to do so, and this is critical, in a way that justifies the outcome on the basis of merit. On the basis of merit. Biasing perceptions of competence and suitability for leadership is, say that better, for suitability for leadership is the primary way that status beliefs about social differences give those differences that independent capacity to reproduce inequality based on that group membership. But it's not the only way. Status beliefs about social differences also bias who people favor for associations and exchange, who do you want to do business with, you want to hang out with, and that creates network disadvantages for lower status actors. I don't need to tell you guys that. Status beliefs also create resistance or backlash reactions, right, to behaviors from low status members that challenge the status hierarchy based on the high status hierarchy based on their social difference. So that is also a problem. I've argued that gender inequality in particular, because so much of gender inequality is carried out interpersonally, that gender inequality in particular persists in the modern world in the face of a lot of technological and social change that could really have nothing to do with gender and work against it, counterforces, that it persists primarily through the effect of gender status beliefs acting in all these subtle moment by moment ways on everyday social relations. As this suggests then, it's the biasing effects of macro level status beliefs upon group differences in everyday micro level status hierarchies that make such hierarchies more than random noise in broader inequality processes. Because of status beliefs, interpersonal hierarchies independently enacted over diverse but consequential contexts, the workplace, as I said, the schoolroom, take on systematically similar shapes in terms of the categories of people who end up more or less advantaged within them and revealed as better. They're better. To the extent that status beliefs about group differences then enact back in the micro situation a corresponding hierarchy. They become influential, they become this, and who speaks up in the classroom, who has great ideas. A corresponding hierarchy, that hierarchy provides its participants with a vivid, apparently valid demonstration of the apparent competence and worthiness of those from high status difference groups. Face it. This in turn reinforces, of course, the cultural status beliefs. In that way, status beliefs are a key to the way actor level status evaluations of who's better act as a mechanism that interweaves inequality based on group differences into modern meritocratic organizations of resources and power. Here we go. Okay, there's a second also important way that status beliefs about social differences reproduce inequality based on difference. This second way is an indirect effect of their biasing effect on social relational processes. So far, I've discussed status beliefs at the macro cultural level, big widely shared beliefs, are really a macro level phenomena, and status hierarchies at the micro interpersonal social relational level. This second effect works at the meso level of organizations. It is well documented, not by me, by a lot of other people, by important people, right? It's well documented that assumptions about the attributes and superiority of dominant groups are often embedded in the structures and practices and procedures by which workplace, educational, government, and other organizations carry out their work. Cherian and Marcus, for instance, document how masculine defaults are embedded in the routine organizational procedures, practices of modern workplace organizations. Victor Ray similarly shows how organizational defaults are often implicitly raised. One such gender, race, or class biased organizational procedures, basically who's the image of the person, who are they thinking of in these procedures, right? Same is true for legal definitions and law things, right? Once these organizational procedures and practices develop, they tend to persist through inertia, right? That's how we do things, right? They persist through inertia and act as independent factors in the continuing production of unequal outcomes in the organization for those of different genders, races, and class backgrounds, independent of any bias on the part of the actors, right? But so then the question becomes, if it's well known that these procedures are an issue, right? How do the assumptions about the nature and superiority of dominant groups become embedded in organizational structures and practices in the first place? How does that happen? How do they get in there, right? Well, new structures and procedures, how do they develop? They're typically developed at the social relational level, right? By committees. We need someone to figure out a new test for us, right? By committees, by teams, the teams working together, how are we going to do it? Or small groups of founders, all the Silicon Valley startups, right? Small groups of founders who are confronted with the problems organizing their work. And you know how it is. You got to figure out how to do something. How do we organize it? You draw the ideas you already have, right? About how, well, let's play until it was here. This is how we organized it, right? Drawing your ideas about how to organize. I argue that status beliefs about social differences are likely to shape what goes on in these, just as they're shaping the other groups, these social relational groups, affecting whose voices are heard, whose interests are heeded or even considered as procedures and structures are designed, who they have in mind as they're doing this. The effect is to inscribe assumptions about greater competence and status worthy of the worthiness of people from some groups compared to others into the very structure of the way the organization does its work, would think so, would favors. In the US, of course, and in a classic famous case, the biasing effect of gender status processes at the social relational level has been clearly and historically documented in the origins of several widely used job classification systems that have the effect, where they come from, right? Have the effect of paying men's jobs better than others in the classic work by Nelson and Bridges, right? Similar status bias processes have also been pointed at by Ray in the origins of race and class biases in organizational procedures. Okay, now I've taken you on kind of a wild ride, right? In this thing, and cultural, all kinds of stuff. But I hope that I've convinced you, if nothing else, that we ignore status at our peril. It's easy to ignore because it's so part of the air we breathe. It may be ancient, and deeply rooted as a form of inequality. But it is nevertheless, I would argue, cultural in nature. And I have an argument I'm totally not going to get into about why it isn't just purely evolved, but that's a whole other thing. But it's cultural in nature, right? And therefore cultural things are not beyond our control. We do make them after all. Even if they seem out of our control because we're all doing it together and not together, but nevertheless, they have changed, they can change. So they're not beyond our control. In this, I would point out that status is like language, right? Which has evolutionary roots, but is still a cultural construction and varies and changes constantly. Use your ear, you hear it change in front of you, right? If we want to create more egalitarian societies, especially societies in which social differences in our society, like race and gender, are no longer powerful, independent determinants of unequal life outcomes, then we have to take into account status processes. Status is a multi-level process that works its effect primarily through these social relations in implicit ways that people rarely notice. It acts as because they rarely notice it, it acts as something like a hidden hand. I mean, we're doing it, so it's not magic, but it seems like a hidden hand because it's just happening, right? That reproduces inequality basis on these differences. While we may never undo status altogether as a form of inequality, because it's so rooted in those cooperative relations, right? We may not get rid of it. But the problem is having these big cross-cutting determinative factors shaping it, right? What we need is more multidimensional things shaping it and a greater attention to the relevance of those to the actual task, the competence of the task, to make it more egalitarian, right? We can undo its most pernicious effects by undermining status beliefs based on major social difference groups. As cultural beliefs, status beliefs have to be widely held. The presumption that they're common knowledge is why they work. Once a person decides maybe they're not common knowledge anymore, compliance goes way down, right? Status beliefs have to be widely held to have effect, and that consensuality and apparent validity can be disrupted. Well, wait a minute. It's not like that anymore, right? Can be disrupted by changing material circumstances and persistent social effort. So social change is possible, but it will not happen without sustained effort. Gender stereotypes, for instance, have changed quite a lot, but they haven't flipped, right? In terms of that, but they have changed enormously since the 70s. Okay, so that's what I've got. I'm happy for questions. I don't know how you want to handle questions.
Why don't I leave?
You want me to take it? Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm happy for questions, all kinds, including why didn't you talk about that? You know, and you know.
Can you address specifically when there are hierarchical strata that can't be ignored when people are in an organization, in a company or business where they're given titles
Yes,
that give them status automatically,
yes,
and how does that impact
Yes.
this?
yes. It gives them status. It gives them power, right? That's the classic power thing. By the way,
Whether deserved or not.
yeah, but there it is. It has that factuality, right? They have the control over the resources and everything that constitute power, and how that works with status. Status both can, if the person is high status as well as having the power, it will enhance their power, right? They will actually have greater power over their, in terms of getting voluntary compliance for people. But if they don't, if their status is questioned and they're low status, then they sometimes get resistance, but also there's evidence that it can, I hate to say it, make them meaner in the role because they have harder time getting compliance, right? And of course, the classic ways people have studied this is a DMV officer who has a lot of power over you and very low status, right? So you can get that tension. So, but status and power are not identical in that situation, right? There is an edge to power, which is different. Status brings, they are practically interwoven. In other words, you go to study them, the people of power tend to have status, So I don't mean that, but they work together. They're interdependent, but they have slightly different dynamics. So you can find cases when they're out of sync. Talking about it's often easier for women to have status than power. Power can be more threatening sometimes, and in that situation, they'll be more resistant for power than for being thought of as someone worthy and competent and able. But the problem is that does bring voluntary compliance, so in the long run can translate into power, and so there can be some complexity there. I don't know if that answers your question. You may have a specific example in mind or
Well, I'm
something.
just wondering how you work around it.
I see.
If you want to affect change and you have to go up again, even if you have status, but you don't have
Power.
the power, and then how do you internally change the dynamic rather than just leave the company? In other words, within a given system, how do you affect change of the dynamic?
Mm-hmm. It's not, just give me the softballs, We'll work with this softball. How you actually, yes, if you have status, can you use it to undermine or to modify the power structure is what you're saying. I think you can, but it's a complex and subtle process and could potentially be dangerous, right? Because the power can be used against you. But basically, typically with status, you can work to build coalitions, right, with others that can allow you to, and the coalition can become a power move, right? Your status allows you to convince others to join the coalition. The coalition then becomes a power thing, a power resource that you can use to try to manage other power resources, right, or to counterbalance. That's right. I mean, that would be, I recommend, that would be my best guess. Yeah.
I'm interested around how you think that it really, the channel through which you think you can disrupt the apparent validity of these like widely held beliefs about status. So I understand it's saying that it's going to be changing material circumstances, that's going to be the major channel. Are there other ways in which people can just start cognitively questioning, like just actually challenge like somebody with perceived status? I mean, I'm even just thinking about right now how academics are being challenged widely about sort of perceived status. And can that change it? Does it have to be material or cognitive? And just,
Of course, there is a material aspect to that challenge too these days. But that aside, there is also a larger critique that you say is a pure cultural critique. What do these people know anyway? That critique. I think you can do it. It's hard. I believe in the power of culture as well as material resources. On the other hand, it's the levers of power are more direct, and you can easy to grab hold of, because an argument about the lack of value of something is you try to gain credence with it, but then there's a challenge over the legitimacy of that argument, and it's a subtle, slippery process of the people going back and forth and really convincing everybody, independent of any money or financial challenge, that Harvard is a dumb place. That it doesn't deserve its status. And you might have a lot of personal anecdotes that make you think, really, there's turkeys everywhere and there's smart people everywhere, which I believe. Nevertheless, and I'm not hustled to Harvard, but but what I'm saying is doing it at that level, it's fine to do it. And you might, in some circumstance, convince a lot of people if you're a very effective influencer, you're very effective getting your ideas out there and persuading others, possibly. Maybe you can do it, but often cultural change is underwritten by material change in that way.
Yeah, I'm curious about the role of information, especially about like performance and the competence of high status individuals. 'Cause, like a lot of your work talks about like expectations are formed, whereas like high status individuals that they're more competent and they're more valued and contributing.
Right.
But what if, but like, I mean, thanks to like modern technology.
Right.
we have access to like very detailed and objective information about their performance. So what happens after people get to know about their actual performance? There might be like gap between their expectation and the actual performance, and how does that affect
The status hierarchy. First, to say that there are several steps in the process that can modify or blunt that actual performance information, being that there's so-called double standards in judging ability and stuff like that. So basically, in a kind of Bayesian way, people tend to take high status people because they're presumed to be competent, so they blow it. Everybody makes a mistake, everybody's human, like that. And so they don't take the first bit of evidence as, no, that didn't work, Whereas the person you didn't think was very competent, you gave them the same task and they did very well, and you think, well, can they do it again? Can they do it again? So there's evidence on them, these are not just anecdotes, these so-called doubles. So there's evidence that a performance of same quality can be judged as indicating higher or lower ability that's affected by these status biases. So that's a little buffer, right, of the direct nasty feedback effect on that. Another potential buffer is a high status person has greater control over these performance metrics than a low status person. And so more ability to be measured on things they think they're going to do well on, and to avoid being measured on things they think they're not going to. Now that's not perfect and everything, but there is that versus, ready or not, here we come kind of thing about the measures. But there still is the information come out at the end. And if real difficult to challenge evidence comes, challenging the performance of a high status person tends to wreck their status, right? They may dodge and weave and whatever, but it tends to feedback and they may reach for power, right? And reach for ways to try to preserve their position, look for a lateral move and all that kind of stuff. Someone was talking about moving to another, do other kinds of things, but it can be very damaging. It's basically betting and losing, right? You told us that bet the house on this, we lost the house, that can be devastating. But there are many ways in which, a high status person knows that, right? In which they work really hard not to for one thing, they may steer the group towards things and decisions and directions that they really do have some ability to make work out and things like that, right? So in a way that the low status person can't steer the group. Yeah.
Thank you. Fascinating talk. Can you talk a little bit about how the changing material circumstances may challenge or cause changes in the status?
So yeah, and I did buzz over these giant topics like that. There are clear evidence from looking at, and the best example, because it's been more measured, are gender stereotypes, right? There's very clear evidence of historical change in gender stereotypes and what is it associated with, right? And again, they haven't flipped, but one of the things that has changed has to do with the nature of competence, right? And competence in what there is, right? Talking about competence being a key part of status, but competence has these two elements. One is like skill, ability, that kind of thing. And the other is training, expertise. And then the other aspect is forceful agency. You can make it happen. You're not just going to sit in the library and be smart, but you make it happen. And right now, it used to be, if you go back to the 50s, women were dumb. They didn't have that IQ, No one thinks that now. Now everyone thinks they're just as smart, right? And they're just as competent. If anything, sometimes they're rated as more competent. And it's well known that since the 80s or so, women are better students, right? They graduate at higher rates and all that kind of stuff, have greater grades. Although it's also well known that this, Natasha Quadlin stuff that shows that for the same grades, women graduates lower paying offers, right? So that's that double standard of ability, right? What are they good at, right? Can they make it happen? And sure, they're good book learning, but can they make it happen? So, but still there has been this change, right? And what's it most closely connected to or correlated with? And it's women's labor force participation, both growing labor force participation, and then after that, entry into the high status occupations and things of that sort. So it's slowly working away at it. Now, the one thing that hasn't changed is all important in maintaining specifically gender stereotypes, and it's unique to gender stereotypes, and that's the care, communion care. And while there is an association of low status people with being more socio-emotional generally, mostly it's their job to smile at others, right? And all that, and all kinds of status differences. Uniquely, gender is associated with caregiving, right? Children, warmth, caregiving, right? And the linking, everyone agrees, men and women, and it hasn't changed, that women are more expressive and warm and communal than men. And the value of caregiving has not gone up. And there it is in terms of one of the maintaining principles of the gender system. But nevertheless, that great material change wasn't pouring in the labor force did it. Now, of course, that would say that if you got men equally involved in the caregiving economy, not only children raising, and they have increased in housework and childcare, but also the care associated industries and stuff, and there is movement there. But those kinds of things do change stereotypes. It's also the case that stereotypes become defunct based on people thinking, well, maybe it was that way in your day, but that's old thinking, it's not the way it is now. They lose validity. It isn't even so much that people come to be, they discard them, they don't, like what happened to that Irish thing? People just forgot about it, right? How stupid, and other things, and that's it's just not that way anymore. People can have experiences that don't match the stereotype they do all the time. Most people don't, a lot of people think, it's not that I believe them, but there has to be a point where it's not just idiosyncratic, right? But the whole group. And that's when you have to have that kind of massive effect. So there has to be a cascade. There's the pluralistic ignorance part and all that about, that everybody, when a belief reaches a point where everybody thinks everybody else thinks, but nobody thinks it anymore. And that's usually the beginning of the collapse of something. Or the change. The thing about gender and race and stuff, they're too deeply embedded. They're not like to collapse, they modify. They modify. Yeah.
So I have a quick question thinking about sort of like the way that you can like reduce the effects of status beliefs.
Yeah.
So under the kind of assumption that that based on what we've discussed, that status is sort of like, it's pretty multidimensional in this place where there's sometimes where status can be more pervasive in other social contexts where different forms of status can be less pervasive.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if in your research, if you found that there are particular social contexts where, status in general can be less pervasive. Because one thing that I was thinking of anecdotally is sort of like in the formal academic setting, there might be more clear status signals. Whereas like if we are outside of the academic space in like a community-based setting, or in like if people join like adult intramural sports or stuff like that, those status differentials tend to be very different because you don't have the formal status signals as well as the sort of power structures that are
reinforcing them.
Yeah, reinforcing.
Yeah, here's the exam. How did you do?
Exactly.
Yeah, and things like that.
So it's like, have you seen any trends between different social contexts?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I didn't say, again, zooming over a lot of things, one thing I didn't say is that status is situational. It's always situational, right? And while you may have some characteristics that advantage you in most situations, you can also think of where it doesn't advantage you. And, like gender is not an advantage to a man in a highly female typed context, right? If people going to judge who's the best, okay, we're going to have, someone's going to stitch something or something, he's not going to be status advantaged in that situation. So it's contextual, and they're always exceptional ones. Most things, especially the things that matter, not stitching, right? Most things that matter that are better rewarded and stuff, the high status groups are more high status, right? But there are contexts when they're not. So first of all, it's highly situational. And then secondly, that means that every human being moves from situation to situation, and they're not all high status, and most of them, they're not high status and all of them and low status. Nobody is. We all move from one situation to another, and have context in different things. And then secondly, what is high status in a situation depends on what the group's doing. And so if you, the great scholar in the classroom, go to some intramural sports in which you're considered to be, excuse me, it's not, doesn't necessarily have any transition or resistance. Now, I would say that understanding that and understanding the extreme variability, even if there's overall patterns in who ends up higher and lower overall, especially in the more rewarded places, doesn't mean that there isn't this variability. And frankly, I think that it's a good thing there is, because that we can work with that, right? But you also asked, are there situations where status is less important, right? Which is different than, because in the intramural sports thing, it may be different status, but there's still status, right? Who's cool in that situation, who's listened to. So it's still there, but there are situations, and they tend to be situations, and it's just something, it's a process that gets more or less intense status. Other things are always happening. It's never just status. So, and it gets more or less. And when it's less intense, more intimate situations, more less goal focused. Even an intimate group can get more status oriented if they're making some big decision or something, some cooperative decision. Are we going to move or not? And things like that. A big thing. But in more intimate, friendly settings, laughing and joking, it can go down for the moment, right? Which doesn't mean that it might not pop back up if something's going, the conversation shifts, and it goes this way or that way, because it could be riding in the background. It's known that you are the high status person and all that, but there are times when it's more of a driving force and what people are thinking about doing, how they're acting, and when it's not. Yeah.
I was just gonna ask for an example. You talked about made-up statuses and how you're able to induce status beliefs. And
Yeah.
for people who haven't read those studies, could you just
Yeah, give an example. Well, what I did is I gave people a little test, and I borrowed some procedures, and I said, first I introduced this. Okay, it's been shown in past research. This is the bullshit, right? It's been shown in past research that there are two types of personalities, S2s and Q2s. I made up a name like that. And I said, this is just the research name for it. We call them S2s and Q2s because I didn't want it to imply A's or B's or whatever, I have some ranking, S2s and Q2s. And what we know about these things is people tend to be one or the other, they tend to be a more enduring trait. It has some effect on their behavior. Okay, now there's a test for this. And what is the test I give them? It's an old test from social identity people where they look at pictures of Klee and Kandinsky, two painters from the same era that have, but they have a different style. And I asked them to choose which ones they prefer. Now, the social identity people paid attention to people, whether they actually preferred Klee or Kandinsky. I ignored that, right? I didn't worry about what they preferred. I simply told them, the results of this test show you're a QT, or the results of this test show you are an S2. And then I put them in an interaction, a task-oriented, working with someone who was the other characteristic from them. And I created a hierarchy between them by having a confederate who acted in the initial creating the beliefs things, acted either assertively. It's a difficult test and everybody's new and they're like, what are we doing here? I'm trying to make these judgments. We have to agree on these things. And someone speaks, right? Versus, or they deferred. waited. Well, I don't know, you go first, you know, and deferred. So we have this Confederate who's kind of prompting a hierarchy to develop in a way that corresponds to the S2 Q2 difference. And of course, I randomized all this, different versions of it. But anyway, what I found is that I came out the other end and they would have two experiences of this, right? Because they meet one person and they deal with them, does this, and then they meet another person from that category, same thing happens, right? And so then, you know, they have 2 points to draw a line, right? And then I say, at the end, I say, who do you think most people, what do you think of these two personality types? I said, how do you think most people would rate the average S2, the typical S2 and the typical Q2? And I asked them a set of questions like status, high status, low status, kind of bipolar differences, high status, low status, capable, incapable, competent, incompetent. I also asked them warm, friendly, all that. I got the corresponding differences. They were high status but colder versus low status and warmer, right? And of course, I was especially interested in the people who, in their experience, people from the other group spoke up and became influential, and they were in a less influential position. Whether they would think most people would think the other group was higher status than theirs, and they did. They did. So that's what those experiments were. And there are different ways I did it. I sometimes biased the hierarchy, my first ones, by paying them differently. But what I found is that if the pay didn't lead to the person acting more assertively or less assertively, then they didn't get the status beliefs at the end. Now, there's other studies that show that in general, when people feel they're better paid and they're richer, they do. And also just having more resources often gives you kind of control of their circumstances a little more. So that happens more often. But I found that just telling people is high status and low status, I paid and all that didn't produce the status beliefs. And the reason why it didn't, the high status people, better paid people said, of course, they're higher status. So that came out. But the low status people said they're not higher status, they're just richer. You know, no, there's not a difference like that.
Okay, we're almost out of time, so why don't we I'll let you.
Yeah,
One more question.
there's a question over there. Yeah,
I guess the other question.
it's okay.
So you commented, kind of early on that the loss in status of certain group of people got down to elected.
Mhm. Well, I didn't say that specifically, by the way, and I made a point of not saying that. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there are some political science things looking at that, Diane Mutz's studies and all that.
Well, if that's true then, and I'm wondering if you can comment more on, you know, when certain groups lose status like that, I'm wondering what you think. Well, do you feel empathy for that group, and what do you think, how do you think it's going to play out?
Oh, yeah. I mean, how can you not feel some empathy for people if they feel insulted in some sense, they're not included, right? And the thing, I mean, that's the fundamental thing that's driving the problem, right? If that's the case, you can't. And there's a lot going on there, right? Why would, say, rural or I mean, you might say it's invidious because people who were more advantaged than then these other groups, suddenly they're losing their privilege. It wasn't ever pure privilege, right? Because it's not the privileged white people that are doing this, right? It's like in the white thing. It's working less white people who weren't privileged. Not in our, you have growing inequality, less and less privilege, decline of unions, all that, less and less leverage. So a lot going on. And then furthermore, they used to have a white advantage. They don't have that either. And you know, so that's harder, right? And so and you can feel why you think, well, why do they have to hang on to that? Nevertheless, you can see that they were suffering from a lot and others dead. So yes, you could have empathy. The other thing is, what about rural well, fewer and fewer people are rural. I taught at the University of Iowa for 6 years. I know about this, and fewer people are rural, and rural life, not rural life and rural values and all that used to be in the public media. It wasn't the dominant thing. It wasn't for a long time. It wasn't anything. There used to be a program called Little House on the Prairie, right? There used to be things like that. People, late night talk show guys like Johnny Carson would talk about being from Nebraska and things like that, right? It used to have a presence. It used to have a presence in the worldview, and it evaporated, right? It became more urbanized. The cool people are more urban. They're just gone. There's no social representation of them. No one knows what that looks like. I know when I lived in Iowa, people would say, talk to other people. I would say, they say, where are you from? And I said, Iowa. And they would say, Idaho. And I said, no, Iowa. Ohio? No, Iowa, right? Even though it's middle, it's the heartland, it's everybody's fantasy of, in my media, there's a way it's not there, right? It's not there. And people with a rural life really feel how I can understand. And people who farm these days are highly educated. They have to be. It's an international business, or tries to be, and is complex, but not understood, not recognized. And people like to be recognized, So Michelle Lamont, right, talks about that, recognition.
Okay, well, thank you very much.